computer.
Okay, I'm gonna start as well. Let me go to speaker view. Okay, I think it's working. All right. I guess if everyone wants the doc, I'm gonna just send it in the chat for the questions. And then Christy, you can begin. I don't know if there's an introduction to this. Good question.
Are we just doing like clips or like cutaways? Maybe we don't need a little intro.
I guess not. Like maybe it could be like edited. I'm not sure how the style will be, but essentially what we were kind of told was like it's kind of like a talk show type of, like The View is like the example they gave us, but we don't have to do that.
That sounds good to me. We could do like a little introduction, maybe, of ourselves and then get going.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Cool. Okay, let me just pull the document up here. Just give me 1 second. Okay, sorry, my fridge is making some weird noises, so hopefully you can't hear them in the background. Or it's a raccoon outside, I honestly don't know, but hopefully it's neither of those. Can you hear that at all?
Like a little bit of dripping?
Yeah.
It's faint, but...
It's faint. Okay, as long as it's not going to distract. It's
I didn't notice that. I
okay,
still can't hear it.
Okay, awesome. Well, maybe we can start by going around and introducing ourselves to get into today's chat. I'm happy to start. My name is Christy. I am a youth advisor on the Cannabis and Psychosis project, and I've been involved with the project for the past couple of years. My background is in psychology and public health, and I also bring lived experience as a family member supporting someone who has gone through schizophrenia and psychosis. You can pass it on to whoever wants to go next.
I'm Leaf. I'm also a youth advisor with schizophrenia, with the Explore the Link campaign, social media campaign. I'm studying anthropology, and I focus around homelessness and substance use as well as harm reduction.
I could go next. My name is Melisha. I started with Cannabis and Psychosis in January as a practicum student. I am a global health major specializing in health promotion and disease prevention. And I've been involved with the Cannabis and Mental Health Project and really passionate about mental health and health equity and health justice as well.
So I'm Elias. I've got lived experience with cannabis use and psychosis, and I live with schizoaffective disorder. I've been working as a peer support worker in early psychosis intervention for the past couple of years, and I've been volunteering with the Cannabis and Psychosis Project since the beginning and helped kind of form the Cannabis and Mental Health Project along the way.
Awesome, thanks everyone. So maybe we can start today with talking about what health means to you and kind of where mental health fits in and your understanding of what mental health is. And I'll open this up to anyone who wants to start.
So I guess health means a lot to me. It sort of encompasses a lot of different things because I take a holistic approach when I think about health. Furthermore, like health is just so important to me. I mean, it's how I live my every day-to-day life. It's that's just my own view. Like it's my most valuable, I wouldn't say possession, but trait that I have is that I like to live a healthy life, and I think that's really important I just think it's really important for myself. Like it's valuable to me.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks, Leaf. Elias or Melisha, do you want to go next?
I mean, I can talk a little bit about what health means to me. Like living with schizoaffective disorder, like health is kind of like the ideal that I strive towards every day. And I like to see it kind of not as a fixed place. Like it's not, I'm healthy. It's like I'm working on living a healthy life. And so it's always kind of like a goal that I'm reaching towards. It's the process of like doing all my self-care every day. It's the ability to like actually make sure that I'm taking the steps that I need to be well over the long term. Um, Instead of just doing things that I might need to cope over the short term that might have like longer term poor effects. And I think the connection with mental health is really interesting because mental health is health. It's like, it's not like our brain is not part of our body. And I think physical health gets like a lot cleaner rep when it comes to just social stigmas. But uh, mental health, mental illness, like poor effects that arise from the mind are just as valid. And I mean, we can all have like a mentally healthy life, even with like some of us who might experience mental illness.
Awesome. Thank you, Elias. And I love thinking about like that longer term view and that holistic approach to health and really considering how it all ties together. I think that's so important. Melisha, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just to like add on to what Elias was saying, like I think health truly is like interconnected with all aspects of us. And like it's mental health is a big component, also our emotional health, our spiritual health. And it's not just physical health. And they all just influence each other to make us who we are and how we feel. And I think health is just influenced by so many things that are not just our body. And it's also influenced by like the factors that are around us. And that's why I think health is such an important thing for us, and it's a human right. And it's something that we all deserve and something that we all deserve to nurture and deserve to lead and have happy lives. So yeah.
I love that. Thank you for sharing. And I love hearing all your different perspectives and seeing the connections in between them because I think they all really complement each other nicely. So thank you. Maybe next I can read a couple definitions out loud of health and mental health, and we can talk about how they align with our definitions or where they differ. So maybe to start, I'll read the World Health Organization or the WHO's definition of mental health, which is a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. Does anyone have any thoughts on that definition?
I mean, I like it as a whole, but maybe as like a critical analysis, like people don't need to be productive to be well, even though like capitalism kind of like dictates it. Like we can live like mentally healthy lives and just be like connected to ourselves or connected to the people around us and like not need to go off and change the world or live like live under like systems that just value what we can give to it. Although that's a bit harder with like the structure of society.
Yeah, that's so true. And it really makes me think like what do we view as productive and who defines what productivity means? And I think that's something that as much as I like this definition as well, I also struggle with that piece of it is that productivity and living fruitfully looks different for everyone. And it doesn't have to align with one view. So when we bring that into a definition around something like mental health, there needs to be room for that subjectivity and like individuality. Leaf or Melisha, do you want to add anything? And if not, that's totally fine. We can go on to the next definition.
I don't like this definition, to be honest. I think mostly because it's like you said, it's not taking the subjectivity or the individual's experiences or what they've been through, because like, can cope with the normal stresses of life. What is a normal stress of life? Like, how do you define that? Like, that's very vague. Come up productively and fruitfully. Not, this one bugs me.
Yeah, that's totally fair. Thank you for sharing. And it's tricky to come up with these definitions that are so broad to really capture something that is so subjective, like mental health and physical health, I would say too. It looks different for everyone, health as a whole. But yeah, this one is a little tricky to wrap my head around personally as well.
Yeah, and I think it just like points out like there is no like one definition that fits all for everyone, right? And I think that's kind of what the Western medical model kind of tries to emphasize, is just these standards of like what they're saying, productivity and realizing your own capabilities. You know, I think that to have a good mental health state, or you don't have to always know that or always be in that to lead a healthy life. I think like life is not stagnant, life isn't perfect. And I think, I guess if they're trying to say like resiliency, if you're able to bounce back from it, then I could kind of agree with the definition. But I definitely do agree with what Leaf and Elias were saying. It's just who defines and who dictates what that means.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing. And that ties nicely into our next definition, actually, from the Canadian Mental Health Association. So they define mental health as the state of your psychological and emotional well-being, and as a necessary resource for living a healthy life and a main factor in overall health. So this one's definitely different. It seems like it's less criteria, like output criteria too. So what do we think about this one? Is this a better fit?
I personally like this definition a bit more, just because they're emphasizing both the psychological and emotional well-being and understanding, kind of like what Elias was saying earlier, the fluidity of our health. And I also like that they're pointing out that it's a resource for healthy living. It's something that influences all other aspects of our life. And it fluctuates. It's kind of like a scale that just continues, and mental health can vary from good to bad, and it's just a main component and influencer of your overall health, whether that's physical health too. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Felicia. I agree. I think it sounds a little bit more like what we're thinking about when we talk about mental health, but I'll open it up to Leaf and Elias if you want to share any thoughts on this one. And if you're good, that's all good too.
I'm
Okay,
good. I like this one a bit better.
cool. So maybe we can move beyond these definitions to talk a little bit about the spectrum of mental health and mental illness, because they are two different things. So maybe before I open it up to you all, maybe I'll just talk about my own understanding of the difference between mental health and mental illness. And my understanding of mental health ties nicely into the definition above, that it's the state of your psychological and emotional well-being. But to me, that does differ from a mental illness, though they are kind of on a shared spectrum. But I think sometimes we use those terms interchangeably, and we forget that everyone has mental health, but not everyone has a mental illness. That's like, if I can make one key point, that's the one I would like to make. And having a mental illness doesn't mean you have poor mental health necessarily as well. It just is something you live with. Like, some people have physical illnesses, and it doesn't say anything about the state of their mental health. Actually, it's just something that people live with. So you can have a mental illness and still have mental health. They're on a spectrum, but they're not one and the same. maybe I'll open it up to you all and see if you have any thoughts on that or thoughts of your own as well.
Sorry, lies. I just because like it's interesting that you brought that up, Christy, and it's just like I think a lot of folks have the difficulty like what is mental illness? Like that definition of what is mental illness. And I guess also like what does that mean for someone in someone's lifetime? Um, I think for the longest time, like I got it confused where it's just like poor mental health could equal or mean mental illness, which that's not the case. And speaking on like my personal like experience with getting a diagnosis, I was diagnosed with PTSD and depression. And for that, like using the indicators and scales and the questionnaires, I found that it was just very prescriptive, I would say. And it didn't really allow myself to understand my own mental health within that diagnosis fully. And I felt like there was a lot of barriers for myself in accessing resources to understand like what you were saying, that mental health and mental illness, it's a spectrum, and you know you can fall anywhere within that quadrant. And it doesn't mean that you can't get better, and it doesn't mean that you have to live with it lifelong. I think that was something that really opened my eyes in my own mental health journey quite recently, and seeking out like different support systems to understand that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing. And I think it's so interesting, and like having a background in psychology. So I learned about all these diagnoses when I was first studying, right? And they're, for one, they're very westernized. The DSM is quite westernized, and two, I think a diagnosis can be helpful for a lot of people to build understanding, but it also is so individual. So that diagnosis is what you choose to make of it, and you don't have to. I would say it's up to you if you want to identify with it in a lot of circumstances. So, like myself and many other people struggle with anxiety, but I don't necessarily identify as someone with an anxiety disorder. It's just something I struggle with, even though I may have been diagnosed with it before. So I think that is like helpful advice that I've gotten in the past, is that your diagnosis is totally up to you and what you choose to make of it. And yeah, just ties in. I thought that might tie in nicely with what you said about that understanding.
And you mentioned the DSM there, so like the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. And it's for like the people who don't know, because it's kind of like a very like clinical term. It's like the book that has like a checklist of all the symptoms for all the mental illnesses. And if you meet like a certain amount of the criteria, then you can be diagnosed with that like illness. And it's important to recognize that a lot of like the symptoms cross over from one to the other, like from one illness to another. And there's a lot of like flexibility even within like what someone might get diagnosed with, depending on like which doctor they go to, how they describe their symptoms, like their own awareness of like what's happening. And it's not always like the most reliable indicator of someone's experience. And in my experience, it has been like incredibly helpful in like getting services and being able to like engage with care and kind of understand the big picture of where I'm at in society, but on like a very minute level. Like if you bring your scale all the way down, it doesn't capture what everyone is going through, because even if two people have the same diagnosis, there might be like 14 criteria. And like, let's say you need seven, like one person might have seven, the other person might have like the opposite seven. So it's even within like a single diagnosis, there's a lot of variability.
Yeah, that's such a good point as well. And ooh, I had a thought, but I just lost it. I'll try and come back to it, but I'll pass it off to Leaf to see if he wants to share anything here as well.
I like that too, Elias. I think that's a really good point because, like, even with my diagnosis, I have anxiety, depression, OCD, and substance disorder. So thinking back on it, like my anxiety, I don't really consider myself to have anxiety now. That's from CBT and DBT and different things. But I guess what I'm getting at is the diagnosis. I have a hard time with myself because I don't really think it's about labeling, or like it's not about labeling when you get diagnosis. Well, it can be, but it's not always. For myself, I think it's more about just trying to live day-to-day life as healthy as I can, and that's just how I try and get by. But I don't know what other perspectives are. I'm just thinking about.
Yeah, I totally agree. I definitely agree with you, Leaf. And my other thought before was that sometimes in order to access help and services, we need these diagnoses, or we need that understanding of the people that we're working with, so they can try and help us better in the way that they understand mental health, right? But I think sometimes we also confuse normal reactions to traumatic situations as one and the same with a mental illness, when it could just be like quite a normal reaction to going through something traumatic or experiencing quite a bit of trauma. Um, so that was my one little.
I've seen that a lot in homelessness. Like I work on a federal research project at my institution around homelessness and youth, and a lot of the most youth that are homeless are actually have mental health of some sort. And a lot of the diagnosis and a lot of the ways they act or people that perceive their behavior as abnormal is really just quite normal based on the circumstances and what they've been through. So I can really relate to that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing. All right. Is there anything else we wanted to add in here? Or do we want to move on?
I guess
Sorry, go Malaysia.
I was just gonna add on to like Leaf's point, like and Christy's point. It's so true that you know, they can be normal reactions, and when Leaf, you're talking about like the youth that you see in the shelters, like, you know, it really comes to show that it's a lot of social factors, a lot of factors that influence our health or mental well-being. That's pretty normal. And unfortunately, it's systematic within and sometimes beyond a person's control, to kind of better those reactions at that moment. And it just takes some time. It takes a lot of support and a community to really come together to bring that and help another person's mental state and then their overall physical health and emotional health. Yeah, just to add on.
I was just gonna quickly say before we move on, like the cultural interpretation of someone's like symptoms can really play into whether they see it as like mentally healthy or like mentally unhealthy as well. Like the idea of like hearing voices in different communities means different things. I mean, in a very like medical model Western society, like we see it as like delusions or hallucinations where someone's brain is misfiring and they're having a bunch of like auditory hallucinations that are maybe saying random things or telling them what to do. But in more like collectivist cultures or even indigenous cultures, like some of that hearing voices can be part of like a spiritual experience where like you could be talking to like the ancestors or you could be like connecting with nature. And even like throughout history, like the idea of like talking with God has kind of changed throughout like society. I mean, like all the prophets and like different religions talk to God in some way. So at some point in history, these like hearing voices was normalized. And even nowadays, like people, when they pray, which a good portion of society does, like they're talking to God in some way and like they feel that connection. And at what point does that become problematic? And depending on like the culture, depending on the environment, depending on like the model you use, it will become problematic at different places.
Yeah, those are awesome perspectives. Thank you everyone for sharing. I think we kind of covered everything on our list here. Are we good to move on to section 2? Okay, cool. And I'm sorry, I hope we're editing that part out. Okay. All right, well, now let's talk about cannabis. So how would you describe cannabis and what does cannabis mean to you? And I think maybe I'll start with Leaf if you'd like.
And this means a lot of different things to me. It's sort of an escape for me. That's just my own perspective. It's also gotten me through some tough times. I mean, it can go both ways. It depends on where I'm at and what my goals and priorities are and what my values are at that current state. I find that changes throughout time, and that's a whole other question. But yeah, no, yeah, cannabis means a lot to me in a lot of different ways, and probably get more into that later.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. And I think that aligns nicely with how we talked about mental health as well, that it can mean different things at different times. And really kind of depends on your context, it sounds like, and other things that are going on in your life at the time, or yeah, that relationship that you have with it at different times in your life. Alicia, if you want to speak to this one, I'll pass it to you.
When I think of like the definition of cannabis, I guess it's a plant that serves a lot of functions for a lot of different people in a lot of different circumstances. And it's not just in North America, but across the world. And I think there's both, there's a lot of different worldviews on this. And I think it's very individual to each person and how they perceive it and how they use it and how they view it. I think the cannabis plant, it's existed for years and it's just gone through a lot of transformations in terms of like whether it's being used for spiritual practices or cultural significance or even personal for a person's health or lifestyle or well-being. And I think it's just a plant used in so many ways that can influence a person's experience and connection to themselves.
Awesome. Thank you both. So we all have different ideas about cannabis, which is nice to hear different perspectives as well of what it means or how you both describe it. So maybe we can all share kind of where our ideas come from about our understanding of cannabis. And I can start if that if that is easiest. So I think my ideas, it was interesting growing up for me in a household where I had like not only authority figures, but those authority figures had my parents had like authority figure type jobs in schools and in law enforcement. So it was interesting hearing the way they described it, because I think they were seeing kind of some of the negative outcomes that can come from young people using cannabis. And they also grew up in a different generation where the war on drugs was like a very real thing, and counterculture was a very real experience that they were seeing. And there was a lot of negativity at that time and fear towards people who use cannabis, and a lot of misinformation about the dangers of it. And I think it was interesting hearing the way that they described it, and that like really formed my understanding of what it was. And then seeing my sibling kind of go through some challenges and eventually going through psychosis as well, in part due to using it, but totally not entirely, which we can talk about a little bit later. So my understanding from a young age was like quite informed by those experiences. But as I've gotten older and had my own experiences and done my own research and learning, it's definitely changed. And especially since being on this project and legalization, I think there's a lot less misinformation, but we still have to challenge some of that because of those stereotypes that still exist for quite a lot of people. So I'll open it up to any one of you to jump in and share where your ideas about cannabis come from.
My ideas from cannabis come from my family. Growing up, excuse me, sorry. My job in my adolescence was to move cannabis from Quebec to Ontario for my father. So I think a big part of what I did and who I knew and who I associated with and what I did and my whole social circle and I lived with a single parent mother in a low income neighborhood. So I mean, I did it as support and save her in education. Um, and it wasn't something that I felt like I really chose to want to do. It was more sort of pushed on me. So that's sort of something that really hits me hard. Um, and you, and honestly, that's what surprises me too in some ways because um, cannabis was fostered in a healthy, like not a healthy way, in a way that was promoted to me. And on my own choice, my own decision making, I chose to leave that, which entitled enclosed a lot of different, encompassed a lot of different things as well. But what I'm getting at is it doesn't work for me.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Leaf. And I think that really points to how formative our families are and can be in informing our early experiences. And unless we challenge those, how lasting those experiences and that information can be.
I know for me, a lot of my information about cannabis growing up came from like my peers on the internet. Um, and this was a few years before legalization. And a lot of like the narrative was either like very much for or very much against, which unfortunately hasn't shifted too much nowadays. And I fell into like the very much for camp. I saw it as like something that could cure anything, that was like kind of the solution to all problems and just like the ultimate way to deal with a hard day. And that eventually led down a path where I developed like an unhealthy relationship with cannabis and eventually had like an episode of psychosis and had to reevaluate that. And then my perspective became more informed by like the clinical side where like cannabis was like a drug in like the purest sense where it has like contraindications, meaning like certain people shouldn't use it and it can have poor effects on some people. And it does have benefits in certain areas, but that needs to be studied further in order to be like validated. Um, and nowadays, like having worked with a lot of people who like use cannabis and whose relationship with cannabis has like gone either towards like problematic or helpful. Um, like I see it as like a way a lot of people cope and kind of like self-medicate and deal with like life. But then there's also a side to it that like people use it for that sense of like creation or connection or spirituality. And um, I think it's important that like all of our perspectives on cannabis come from different places and we're all kind of like at the nexus of all of our connections to cannabis. And so we'll all have like different ideas of what cannabis is. And it's important to find out like what what those relationships are that are influencing us and how we can kind of take those going forward and develop our own way of like seeing and interacting with cannabis that is like healthy, as opposed to something that I know for me ended up being a bit more on like the problematic side because it interfered with a lot of like my mental wellness.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Elias. And I think you and Leaf both spoke to something really important, which is that it's so personal, that relationship to cannabis. And it can, and like you said, like some people use it because they find it can be really helpful in certain areas. And for some people, it just doesn't help them. And that can be said, I think, of any substance. It is an individual relationship. And about how you use it and if it's interfering with other areas of your life. But I really like that you both kind of talked about that spectrum that does exist with cannabis. And it doesn't need to be so divided or so polarized that it's really, really good or it's really, really bad. It is that individual relationship. Alicia, do you want to add anything?
I think my experience is very similar to like Elias's view. And for me, how cannabis was like the idea was introduced was through my peers and my friends who started using it as an escape and to deal with, you know, kind of get the feel good effects of cannabis and use it as a reward sometimes, after a tough day of work. And that kind of, and what I noticed with my peer groups is that it started off initially good and something that did help them and have them have good experiences. And then over time, as they depended on it more, I started to notice, like how Lise was saying, it kind of affected other aspects of their life in a way that wasn't balanced, in a way that wasn't helpful to them. And sometimes with that comes the difficulty of accepting that. And I've noticed that with a lot of youth, and especially a lot of diaspora youth, and there's been an increase in cannabis use in a lot of diaspora youth, with, I guess, dealing with the coping of intertwining of two cultures and their difficulties of adjusting and using cannabis. I noticed it just kind of really opened their eyes to see, like, sometimes it opened their eyes for the good and realizing what they need to improve and take a step back and build their health and build their mental health in the long term, and not just using cannabis. But for some folks, it's, like I said, it's just so difficult to accept, and it takes a bit of some time to kind of get to that level. But that's why it's important to know, individually, like reflecting, turning into yourself and understanding, like, how does this affect me? Is this actually working for me? And just being reflective of your use. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you all for sharing. And Alicia, I really like what you said about finding that balance. And I think with cannabis or alcohol or any substance that we know we need to kind of be cautious around for different reasons, it's like, how much is it adding to your experience versus what is it taking away? And what are those impacts beyond that night or that day or however often you're using it? So I really like how you all spoke to how individual it is. And I think we should probably talk about why people use cannabis in the first place. And big reason people use it is to get high. So what does that even mean? What does it feel like when you're high? What are the effects of feeling high? And of course, this doesn't have to be personal experiences. This can just be your general understanding. So I'll open that up to anyone who wants to speak to this.
I can start us off. I know for me, when I first started like smoking cannabis, like it wasn't what I expected. I kind of got like really into my body, and I like my senses would get like heightened. And actually, the very first time I smoked cannabis, I heard like a train going around, and we were in like a national park where there weren't any trains anywhere near. So I'm not 100% about how connected that was to the reality we all share, but over time it started to change insofar as it would like bring me more and more into my body. It became like harder to like socialize with people, but it felt good in a way. Like it, even though it was like disconnecting me from the people around me, like it flicked that little switch in my brain that said like, oh, like I feel good now. So I kept like going back to it and going back to it. And the high eventually changed. So instead of like it flicking that switch that said I feel good, like the switch would be kind of down all the time where I'd feel bad without it, and then I need to like get high just to get back to my normal. And so like it didn't have the same effect, and I needed to like smoke more often in order to like feel okay again. And it eventually changed into something that would start affecting like my perceptions of reality. I started to have like thoughts and beliefs that weren't connected to like the world around me. And I'd have like all these experiences that I couldn't quite explain. And kind of coming through it, and after I've kind of sorted out my relationship with cannabis and to like realize that it's had like ill effects on my health, I've realized that that kind of triggered a lot of experiences that kind of pushed me away from reality, as opposed to what I'm trying to do now is like fully connect to reality.
Yeah, thanks, Elias. You put that so well. I really like how you spoke to that. And it is interesting to think about how that switch from feeling good to then needing it to feel good, and that relationship between how often you're using and why you're using as well. Maybe Leaf and Melisha, either of you want to jump in, please feel free.
Yeah, sure. I think like I remember when I first got high. I think I was 12 or 13, and I was going to grade 7, and it was one summer, and I really liked it. And once I did it, I was hooked. Like though I was just I loved it, and it wasn't like I was hooked like an addiction at first, but it was more like something that gave me a connection to people around me because I didn't have any friends. I didn't have much to do on my own. I played rugby, which was cool, but when I started smoking pot, I had a bigger network around me, and it was also a source of income. So it was a big way for me to save for an education, and also it was creating an identity for myself, which I didn't really realize, and it was interesting. I really like that identity because that's who I was when I was younger, and I still relate to it sometimes. But I need to I often bring myself back to the moment. Regardless, when I get high, I feel like I'm out of the moment sometimes. I didn't notice this until I started doing meditation, but I used to always need it, and it wasn't like I enjoyed it, and that's why I needed it because I enjoyed it. And I remember when I first moved out west to Alberta to get away, it wasn't helpful. Like I moved out there just to quit cold turkey, and it didn't help anything because I didn't get to the root of the problem. But getting high for me is just it really used to make me feel calm and centered, but now it makes me feel very uneasy, and that's because my values have changed, I think.
Yeah, that's such an important point. Thank you for sharing. And I think again that ties into what Elias said about that, how the relationship with it can change over time, and back to why you're using it as well. And when your values changed, it's interesting to see how your experience with it changed as well. Alicia, do you want to add anything?
I think that, like we were saying, like cannabis use and what it means differently across different cultures, and I think there's definitely a cultural significance and use for it, as well as it's a plant that's existed for years and centuries. I think the earliest it was dated was around like 200 BC, something like that. And in religions like in Hinduism, it was used in spiritual festivals and spiritual practices, and it's used in a celebratory way, probably not regular, but maybe in like yeah, something to commemorate and something to a part of their spiritual identity. And similar to like Rastafarianism, that's also a way of life that they embrace cannabis into their day to day. And I think, they have had quite challenges too with the legalization and criminalization of cannabis, and how that interfered with their culture and their spiritual practice. And I think we've really talked about and touched on like the mental health use of it, whether that's for self-medicating or trying to alleviate some of the mental health symptoms or conditions that we have, like depression or anxiety or PTSD. I know some folks, there's some research and background on supporting that. It may help some folks. And I think also what we were talking about, like it's also socially in some circles accepted. It's kind of like a norm, this like subculture, and what Leaf was saying, and the factor of identity. And I think it kind of intervenes in different subcultures. Like there's a study that at a conference that I attended where they noticed a significant increase or use of cannabis in bisexual women. And it was when they studied it, it was because of the identity of wanting to appear more masculine, appear less femme. And so it's just very interesting to see that there's so many different nuances to why people use cannabis across the world and across cultures. Yeah.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Thank you for sharing. And I know there's some interesting Canadian research that's come out in the last little while about gender norms for young people and using cannabis, and how for girls they see it as less feminine, which is really interesting. And so they may end up in riskier situations trying to access it. So it's a whole other point, but just something I thought of when you spoke to that. And I think you're bringing up an important point in that a lot of people do use it recreationally for fun, the same way people might use alcohol or other substances. And maybe I'm dating myself. I don't know if people still use this term, but I remember when I was in high school and there was parties, you'd have like the stoners and the drinkers, and sometimes people who would like mix among groups, but it's pretty separate. And so I think that's an important point, that it can be used recreationally, and that's how a lot of people start using. And for some people, that's not a problem. That's something that works for them. But again, it comes back to that individual relationship. And I wanted to add that in before we kind of mention any other problems that we've talked about some, but are there any other problems or risks that we can think about that are associated with cannabis use?
Can I
Even around, yeah.
jump in there? Because I think the bringing up the idea of relationships kind of ties into another problem, which is like cannabis use disorder, which is like the clinical way of saying like addiction. Because it can happen, and like depending on when someone starts, if they start at a younger age, like under 18, it's actually more likely that they'll develop like a cannabis use disorder, like an addiction. And it's important to recognize that like our relationship with substances and cannabis in particular in this instance is like a relationship. It's something that we like nurture. If we don't use, we still have a relationship, although it's more distance. If we use, we have a closer relationship. And that idea of like reflecting and trying to figure out like if that relationship is helpful is really important, because like we've been talking about, sometimes that relationship can start, we can get support from it and we can feel good with it. And it's like a really good friend we can go to when we're feeling however we want to feel. But then maybe that friend turns out to be like a little like anxiety provoking, and like the when we go to cannabis, we start to like feel anxious or start to have some like negative effects. And like maybe that's when we need to start questioning, like, okay, should I still keep going to this relationship or like these needs, like is it still a good thing? And then being able to continuously question like what that relationship is like. Is that relationship taking up so much of my time that like all the other relationships in my life are suffering? Am I not being able to like go play sports? Am I not being able to read books? Am I not being able to hang out with my friends? Is my like family life kind of falling apart? All because like I'm strengthening my relationship to cannabis so much. These are all good questions to keep in mind, because like we've been talking about, a lot of people do kind of go to cannabis for fun at first. It's uh, like a stage of experimentation, just trying to see what's out there in the world. And it's not always kind of critically examined at first. It's just like, oh, like this is just like a once in a while thing where I can have some fun doing it. But recognizing that like even without using cannabis, you still have that relationship, and the more you use, the more you strengthen that relationship, potentially at the expense of other parts of your life. Although for some people, strengthening that relationship can actually mean that they have like a more robust support system and like they feel better. And so that's why that analysis is so important, to see if cannabis is like a friend you want to hang around with.
Awesome. Thanks, Elias. I totally agree. And it makes me think of how we all have relationships to everything in our life, like relationships to everything that affects our health as well. And evaluating those relationships, cannabis and other impacts, right, is so important, in recognizing how they're impacting you specifically and not the people around you. And that's hard to do when you're younger, because it seems like, oh, this is great for everyone else. I want to keep up. I want to do what everyone else is doing. And it can be hard to recognize that maybe this isn't the best thing for you, and that's okay. Leaf or Melisha, do you want to add anything else about anything we haven't talked about yet related to problems or risks with cannabis?
I think kind of like going earlier back to like when we see cannabis as like this, using it recreationally and socially, I think there's also sometimes we downplay the effects of it, and that really plays a big risk factor with our sensory, right? When some folks with driving, for example, you know, they may feel that they're okay, that they're comfortable, that they've mastered their high, that they can and do and go out on the road and do risky, I would say I call them like risky behaviors, and that's kind of a problematic relationship because although it's a substance and it can affect you in many ways, and you know there's so many factors that you don't know that influence that on a day to day, and not only are you putting yourself at risk, but you are also are putting others at risk. So it's important that, you know, you be reflective of your cannabis use. You know, is it something that you need to do, to risk another person's life by doing something like driving or doing, and you notice that it's changing over time. So, and especially with even like beginner users, I think that they really sometimes can downplay the negative effects of cannabis because of the feel good effect. And that's totally normal. But it's just something that we need to be critical and reflective because, at the end of the day, cannabis is a substance and there's always both goods and harms related to that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Melisha. And I think that point about the balancing the good and bad, but especially with driving, is so important because cannabis has only recently been legalized, and there's so not enough information to say that it's okay to have any in your system when you're driving, and that it won't impact those sensory abilities and other people around you. Such a good point.
I strongly agree with what Isha and Elias were saying, especially about the relationship. Like, I noticed that relationship a lot with myself with cannabis, but more so, what I want to get at is the physical aspect that I've noticed for myself. Because I've eaten edibles, but I was never addicted to edibles. I was addicted to smoking pot. So I found when I was able to quit, my lungs really thanked me in a way. And I actually did a smoking cessation group with CMHA Ottawa, and when I was doing that, it really helped me learn to connect with myself, because you started every group with 2 to 3 minute meditation, and I started incorporating that into my daily life, and it was all about just noticing your lungs. And, you know, I was coughing up shit. I was not feeling great. I was having a low ambition, low motivation. There were a lot of factors for me, and because of that, I wasn't happy with the relationship with me and cannabis. When I was able to quit, I noticed a lot of changes in my physical health as well as my emotional. So I find when I use cannabis, I revert to Little Leaf. It's something me and my counselor have talked a lot about. We did an empty chair thing, but the point is I'm getting at is Little Leaf has these needs, but he can't really cope. He can't really cope by himself. So he goes to cannabis. This is my cannabis use disorder, of course. However, when I'm big leaf, 26-year-old leaf right here, I have other things that I can do to manage the addiction or the craving or and I think a big part of it is noticing what your relationship looks like. And just what Elias said, is it the expense of other things or is it benefiting you? If it's benefiting you, then there's no issue. If it is hindering some other things, then it might be something bigger at play.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing, Leaf. And I think that tie to physical health is sometimes forgotten. So I'm really glad you mentioned that. Thank you. So based on all that we've talked about already, and we've talked about a lot, is there anything else we want to expand on when we talk about the relationship between cannabis and mental health, or how you would describe that relationship?
I think the relationship between cannabis and mental health is long and complex, and it changes throughout time as well. I know my relationship with cannabis and mental health was like in the beginning it was helpful because it like made me feel good, and then it wasn't so helpful because it like made me feel disconnected, and then it was very not helpful because it kind of like exacerbated my psychosis. But in my work at the clinic, even people who've had like similar diagnoses with me, like depending on like the harm reduction methods they take, like it being able to reduce their THC and increase their CBD, and maybe even like going towards like oils instead of smoking, like they can have positive relationships with cannabis. And like I think the idea with mental health is that it is such a personalized thing, that we're all located in such a unique place that it's hard to prescribe a single like way that cannabis will affect mental health. There are some like overarching things like the connections between cannabis use and depression, anxiety, and psychosis, and like the an emerging connection with like suicide, although there isn't necessarily like causality proven in really any of those, because it's a really complex thing to evaluate. But it's important to recognize that like our mental health is related to cannabis and substance use, and um like substances are like mood altering, so like it will change how our mental state is. And going back to the idea of like relationships, like we have relationships with everything in our life. We have relationships with ourselves through like our emotions, through our psyche, through our beliefs, through our like values, and like our mental health is kind of like a reflection of all of that. And if cannabis is changing that relationship within ourselves as well as the relationship outside of ourselves, then we have to ask similar questions. Like, is this still something that's like fueling me? Is it still something that's providing a benefit? Is it still something that is like allowing me to be myself? Or is it kind of like replacing bits of myself that were positive and that I really enjoyed and that were like protective for me against like the stressors of life? And it's kind of replacing everything as like a central part of me and taking away my ability to cope in other ways. And in that way, like it can actually replace our natural ability to develop ways of dealing with like emotions and thoughts and anxieties and sadness and even like altered states that we might be able to like build up in ourselves naturally through kind of exposure to them and through connecting to our environment, as opposed to simply connecting with a substance.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a good point, Elias. And I think it comes back to reflecting on why you're using anything or doing anything um, that relates to your health in the first place. And is it building you up, or is it perhaps doing a little bit of both, building you up and bringing you down? And when does that balance shift? And I think something that we talk a lot about on the website, but that, and we've gotten into this a little bit here, but is that cannabis affects everyone differently. And for some folks who are predisposed to things like psychosis, it can, my understanding of it, and this I think is still being studied, but my understanding of it is that for folks who are predisposed to psychosis or schizophrenia, it can sometimes speed up the trajectory upon which that psychosis or schizophrenia occurs. So it, because I have a sibling who's diagnosed with schizophrenia, I've been told that while that was likely going to happen to him all along, because he used cannabis, it happened sooner. And so it's not that it caused it to happen. It's just that he already had that predisposition and it was a bad combination for him. And that was my understanding from like as a teenager when I was 16, that was what I was told. And that really formed my own opinions on cannabis. And I held quite strong negative opinions for quite a long time. And I wasn't around other people in my life who were using it. Like it wasn't a big thing in my friend group or anything like that. So that was really the formation of that belief that I had in understanding. And as legalization has happened and I've gotten involved in this project and even like taught a course, TA'd a course on drugs and society, like my understanding has just changed so much. And I really recognize now that that individual relationship. And if I keep emphasizing it, that's why, because it does impact everyone differently. And it can add to some people's lives. It can be something that's really helpful for them in more ways than one as well. We talk a lot about cannabis. We haven't really specified the difference between THC and CBD, and CBD doesn't affect your brain in the same way, so it doesn't give you that high feeling, but that there's some evidence that it can be used in other really positive, healthy ways. So I think all of that is to say that my understanding was quite negative in the beginning and has become a lot more neutral over time, and just reflects that it is that individual relationship. And with this course, I don't think we're trying to tell anyone what to do. I think we're just trying to provide you with a range of opinions and experiences so that you can make better choices for yourself. Melisha and Leaf, do you want to add anything here?
I was just gonna like bring back to like the conversation and point we were talking about like what mental health is, and like we were saying, it's a spectrum, right? And it's not always stagnant. And where does cannabis fit in within that spectrum? And I think, like we were saying, it's individual to each person, and it can come into a person's life in many stages, right? Whether it's in the youth phase when you are trying it out, when you are curious, or if you're self-medicating, whether to kind of alleviate poor symptoms or poor mental health, or whether it is to like increase or help you with that feel good effect. And I think like we were saying, within that mental health spectrum, I think cannabis use also kind of falls in that spectrum in different ways for different people. That's kind of how I like to think about it when I'm kind of trying to understand the relationship with mental health and cannabis. And I think it also is something that just is something that you kind of learn, and is very individual to you as you may or may not use it. Like you're saying, your understanding of it grew as you grew older. And I think that also is what's happening with a lot of folks, even those who may have had a horrible or terrible negative notion towards cannabis. I've seen them use it in their older parts of their life when they're aging, and it's just, I think, just to highlight, it's just a spectrum, and cannabis can fit into mental health in many different ways, whether that is positive or negative or not at all. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. And Leaf, I saw you unmuted if you want to add anything. You're good. Okay. So do you think most people share this understanding of cannabis and mental health? And we talked about a few different understandings, but do you think anyone shares kind of how we've talked about it? Or if they don't, why not?
So I know working with people at the early psychosis intervention clinic, a lot of the people coming in who have like blossoming relationships with cannabis, they kind of fall into the same way of thinking that I used to be in when I was like first being introduced to cannabis. That like, oh, it's just like a good thing, that it's helping, and that like it can't be bad, essentially. Um, and I think that's like kind of perpetuated by like a lot of like online communities that really bolster the effects and kind of like exaggerate some of the literature. But then you also have like people on the opposite end where they fully believe in the war on drugs, and they think people who use any substance should be like criminalized and thrown in jail and imposed with like mandatory minimums, and that like drugs are the scourge of society. And um, I think that finding like that nuanced relationship is a little harder, because like there are certain problems that arise from like substance use, like especially early substance use before the age of 18. Like that kind of increases your risk for developing like mental health problems and like even cannabis use disorder. But there's also some benefits. Like there's certain diagnoses that can be benefited from cannabis use, and there's certain people who just plain and simple enjoy their use and don't have any like negative effects from it. And so finding that like middle ground and locating ourselves in like our spectrum of mental health with relationship to cannabis is such an important thing, because there are a whole lot of people in the world and a whole lot of people with a whole lot of agendas. And we're going to go into a bit further about like the war on drugs and kind of where people's beliefs about cannabis historically have come from. But right here and right now, like the world is a very diverse place, and it takes a lot of effort to figure out our kind of like location within the networks around us. And I'm hoping that other people share our views and that hopefully these are helpful for all the people watching. I also do recognize that there's still a lot of that polarity where people are kind of on opposite ends of the spectrum and at each other's throats.
That's such a good point. And it really makes me think to some of the feedback we've gotten, especially on social media throughout our time working on this project. We've had a lot of defenders of cannabis, very, very strong worded defenders of cannabis. And then we've had a lot of people saying, well, actually, yeah, this has happened to someone I care about, or this has happened to me. They're not off base here. And I think we need to recognize that there's, in a lot of ways, this is not a new substance, but this is new for a lot of people, this legalization piece. And I think it's a little bit easier to recognize things like alcoholism, because alcohol has been a legal substance for quite some time. And when we think about the negative effects of cannabis, a lot of people are still learning about that. And just because it hasn't happened to you or it's been like a positive impact on your life doesn't mean it doesn't happen to anyone. And we all accept that alcohol isn't a good thing for everyone, but I think we're still working on that narrative with cannabis that it isn't a good thing for anyone, because to a lot of people, it seems harmless, when we know that things that seem harmless often are not. And it really comes back to that relationship that you have with it individually. Does anyone else want to add anything to this question? Okay, maybe we can cut this part out. Sorry. But I think we already talked about how your understanding, did we talk about this, or does anyone want to speak to this? How has your understanding of the relationship between mental health and cannabis changed over time? I think we kind of talked about it. Yeah, okay, cool. Okay, what would you want a peer to know about cannabis and mental health that we maybe haven't talked about yet today? I have two things I can say really quick that are two of my favorites that are easy to remember. So one is that if you are a young person, it's best to delay your use as much as possible. It might be something you're interested in, but please try and remember that your brain is still growing. And if, like Elias said, if you start when you're under 18, it can have more negative impacts. So even though everyone around you might be doing it, if you can delay your use, that's awesome. And if you don't want to, that's also fine. But if you can go low and slow, THC is a pretty powerful substance. So starting with a dose that's not too high can help to prevent some of those scarier or negative impacts. Sometimes you can have things happen like a bad trip, and it doesn't necessarily mean you're experiencing psychosis, but it can also be really unpleasant at the same time and feel awful when you're in it. So if you are first starting out, there's no need to choose the highest THC percentage. You can definitely start with something small, maybe even something that's balanced with CBD, and really just take your time and see how it impacts you first, and not just the people around you who may be using other things that may not be a good fit for you.
I would want to know, I would want a peer to know fuck. It's uh, right. No. Okay. So, I'm muted.
Does anyone else have anything they want to share for this piece?
I think for me, I'd want a peer to know that like substance use is like a very complicated thing. And I mentioned earlier that like cannabis is like a drug, and like all drugs, like it has certain uses and certain things that it might kind of affect people in a negative way. And that we do know some things about it, and there are certain like harm reduction methods that people can take, and being mindful of like your physical health as well. So trying to avoid like smoking it if possible, um, using more like oils and potentially even like vaping, being able to recognize that like high THC is often a risk factor for kind of like the poor mental health outcomes. So being able to kind of keep it lower than like the maximum you can get. I think in a lot of like the studies, high THC is defined as like over 15%. So in like our current market, that doesn't seem that high because we have like flowers that go up to like 30%, and then like all the concentrates that go up a whole lot higher. And so being mindful that like THC has risen over time, and that like it's kind of a new substance in terms of like the actual composition of like CBD to THC. Keeping in mind that CBD has like protective factors against THC as well. So if possible, find something that at least has some CBD in there, because a lot of the flowers and concentrates that have really high THC kind of filter out the CBD. So if you can get something with CBD, it's an added protective factor. Delaying use obviously can help, and if you're in doubt, like there's a really good harm reduction resource from CAMH um, that I think we can link to in the resources, that goes through kind of like 10 harm reduction tips, or uh, like suggestions for safer use for cannabis. That's really helpful in just keeping mindful during this development of your relationship with cannabis.
Awesome. Thanks, Elias. And I think you talked about a good point about that harm reduction piece. And especially if you're going to use other substances as well, like alcohol and tobacco, it's important to know how those interact with one another, and just keep that in mind when you're first starting out. And I think we learned a rhyme a while ago. Maybe one of you knows it. I'll see if I remember it. But beer before grass on your ass, grass before beer in the clear. I don't know if we're allowed to say that, but essentially, if you have alcohol in your system first, it can enhance the effects of THC, and that can really throw you off, or even cause something that a lot of people call like greening out, which is really nasty side effect of mixing alcohol and weed, or sometimes just really strong weed, where you can feel really faint and nauseous, and yeah, it's really unpleasant. Does anyone else have anything they want to add here?
I have one quick thing that I actually remembered. If you're exploring the relationship between cannabis, I encourage you to explore it. And for a fellow peer, like I think a big part of it isn't being told what to do, but it's about finding it out for yourself. So I encourage you to notice what's going on while you're using, if you're using, and just notice it, and perhaps discuss it with someone that's really close to you, if you're concerned about it, that is. If not, then I just encourage you to be aware of how it affects you. emotionally, mentally, physically, and spiritually.
And it's okay not to use it all if that's your choice as well. I mean, lots of people choose that. It's um, like a valid choice. People don't need cannabis in their life, even if some people find it helpful. And in terms of like harm reduction, like the way to reduce the most harms is to not use.
Awesome. Alicia, do you want to add anything? And you don't have to.
I think for point wise, I think we're good, but I'll just do a little blurb in case they need this for edits. For more harm reduction, need to do that again. Cut, Rob, thank you. For more harm reduction tips, you can visit the Cannabis Corner and the Mental Health Mind Box.
Is that a wrap?
Yeah. So should I pause or stop the recording?